Before we actually go into your four imperatives, which I find really radical, you started the book by talking about great resignation and how it relates to why this radical collaborations is important these days. So can you tell us about this great resignation, why you actually started the book by talking about that? What kind of problems and relationship between them that you can probably relate to the radical collaboration?
Yeah. So when I wrote the manuscript that turned into the book, it was sort of at the height of the pandemic, the final few months before we had any vaccines out or any available. But there was this also emerging phenomenon of people quitting their jobs. And I think if you peel back the layers on why that happened, you can see something that probably could have easily been predicted because it's something that had built up and just finally came to a head during the pandemic. And it's sort of these two parallel movements. There is, on the one hand, over the past, let's say, half century, there's been sort of these long-term longitudinal studies looking at disengagement at work, mistrust in the world, and a desire for meaning and a complete lack of meaning as well in the world of work. So if you look at, for instance, disengagement, it's been growing and growing for decades. In the book, I quote, I think the 2018 study, which was at like 84%, and now it's at like 86%. So 86% of workers today feel disengaged from their jobs. And that's anywhere from passive disengagement, just like whatever, I'll get through the day, to active disengagement, which is much more toxic, right? I think we probably all experienced people that can have a very toxic effect on the workplace and destructive effect. So disengagement is a real problem, and it's been growing for decades. Mistrust is a real problem. It's true in the world of work and in the world of society, government, institutions, etc. Just more and more people mistrust so many of the foundations of the way our world works today. In the world of work, this includes, like, I think it's around 56% of people mistrust their CEO, don't believe their CEO has their best interests at heart, don't believe their CEO tells the truth. It's a pretty startling number. And then lastly, meaninglessness. A lot of people have increasingly found that they have an expectation that they should have some sort of meaning and purpose through their work. The reality is most people feel like they're not getting it. Here in America, 9 out of 10 people would be willing to give up 23% of their future lifetime earnings just to have more meaning in their job, to have a meaningful work experience, one in which they derive a sense of purpose and fulfillment from it. By the way, that's more than most people will spend on housing in their lifetime. So there's this realization that meaning, this sort of global realization and awareness and awakening to the fact that we are, as human beings, meaning-seeking beings. Meaning is important to us, fulfillment, purpose, etc. So all of these things really came together in the Great Resignation. And I think it was a great way to start the book because it sort of speaks to something that we can all see and experience and read about happening around the world. But it touches on all these themes that also are part of explaining why radically collaborative companies are growing in the world. So companies that have really eschewed dominator hierarchies, companies that have a non-hierarchical structure, companies that make autonomy and self-organization sort of first-class organizing principles within the company. Why these type of companies growing around the world. Just over the last decade, they've more than doubled in number and currently are comprising somewhere between 7 and 8% of companies around the world. So that's important to understand too. And I think it's part and parcel of this trend that we've seen over the last several decades and this sort of emergence of a phenomenon like the Great Resignation. It's all tied together.
Wow, those are pretty staggering statistics that you quoted just now. So the three things that you mentioned just now, disengagement, mistrust, and meaninglessness. So I think it was probably much more prominent in the Western world. In Asian, we do see some of this great resignation trend, although it's not as severe in the Western or US. But I think everyone during the pandemic felt something maybe enlightened or something throughout these hard times, I guess, where they could see probably the work is less meaningful than maybe the other parts of their lives. So I think, yeah, this is actually a trend that I feel myself as well in my daily life. During pandemic, everyone worked from home and you try to question, okay, does this work actually worth it? You spend so much time to actually work, but then you didn't spend much time on the other stuff. And you mentioned this thing about dominator hierarchies, right? So it could be one of the reasons why people are disengaged, people has a lot of mistrust and less meaning in their work. So can you tell us more, what is this dominant hierarchies? Maybe for
Yeah,
those listeners who haven't read your book.
yeah, totally. So the term hierarchy itself can be used in many different contexts. In some of those contexts, we wouldn't think it's positive or negative, or it's just a description, right? Like you can think about like a taxonomy of animals. They're organized in a hierarchy and how we break things down. So that's one way to think about hierarchy. There's a very specific type of hierarchy, though, that we can see in many organizations around the world that's referred to in sociology as a dominator hierarchy. That's definitely meant in a much more pejorative sense. And what we're really looking at is a hierarchy in which privilege, power, resources are sort of unevenly distributed and concentrated at the top. So it's the way of putting together an organization based on ranking, in which the higher you are in the ranks, the more powers of coercion you have over people beneath you. It's part and parcel of sort of a misunderstanding of human behavior that flourished in the early 20th century called behaviorism. It was basically pioneered by scientists like B.F. Skinner. As it's turned out, it's been just debunked in so many different ways that human behavior is much more complex than the behaviorist lens. At the outset of the 20th century, basically, the idea was that human behavior boiled down to carrots and sticks. Will be incentivized by carrots and disincentivized by sticks. And the only reason people would work and produce and perform at high levels is through some combination, some careful sort of scientific management of those carrots and sticks on your workforce. That's had a lot of disastrous effects. It was first pioneered in the field of manufacturing, but it was very quickly taken into knowledge work fields like software development. And it just turns out that organizing work that way turns out to be growth inhibiting. It reduces people's motivation, intrinsic motivation, I mean. It reduces the sense of passion, meaning, fulfillment that they get from their work. It reduces their sense of autonomy. Even if you just look at autonomy itself, that alone can account for so much success. The more meaningful decisions people get to make in pursuit of an outcome, the more likely they are to succeed at the outcome. The more you take away their ability to actually make meaningful choices in pursuit of an outcome, the less likely they are to care about the success of the outcome. So yeah, there's just all this sort of fascinating stuff that comes together around this. So dominator hierarchies themselves are just a manifestation of a misunderstanding of human behavior that I think is slowly being corrected. The industry, the business world, it always is lagging behind the science world. The psychological sort of understanding of human beings, sociological understanding of human beings. And so I think today we're just seeing the world of business start to catch up to insights that were gained 50 years ago in the world of science.
So when you mentioned about this, of course, like for many of us, we could relate because this is like a common practice in many companies, traditional or just normal companies. And I think some people refer to it like command and control, bureaucracy, and Taylorism. I think the situation in which you have some kind of ranking and the power, as the higher you are, the more power that you have. And thus you think that you can control the people below you. So I think that also is probably one of the reasons why people are disengaged, especially if the bosses or the managers are not considered a good boss, right? So people might have different opinions, but they just do whatever they're told. And I think that's probably one of the source of this disengagement, mistrust, and meaninglessness.